Hello there, this is Alan Murphy, the pastor of New Barn Christian Fellowship in Kent in England. We've been looking at a series on women of the Bible, and we've looked at Sarah, we looked at 3 weeks on Rachel, and last week we looked at the midwives in Exodus, Shiphrah and Puah, and today I wanted to look at Miriam in Exodus chapter 2. So I'll start with reading from Exodus chapter 2 if you've got a Bible and you want to follow. Okay, I'll read from verse 1. Now a man of the house of Levi, or Levi, more correctly spelt, married a Levite woman, and she became pregnant and gave birth to a son. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, she got the papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. So you may recall that the Hebrew midwives were given the commandment to kill the Hebrew boys as they were born, because they were too numerous, and the Pharaoh felt quite threatened by the number that were being born. So that's the background a little bit. And then she placed the child in this papyrus basket, put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. And that sister is Miriam. Verse 5, then Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the riverbank. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her slave girl to get it. She opened it and saw the baby. He was crying, and she felt sorry for him. This is one of the Hebrew babies, she said. And then his sister asked Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you? Yes, go, she answered. And the girl went and got the baby's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you. So the woman took the baby and nursed him. Isn't that interesting that the mother actually gets paid for nursing her own baby? And then in verse 10, when the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son, and she named him Moses, saying, I drew him out of the water. Now what we are trying to do is we're trying to look at Hebrew words in our studies and draw out from those Hebrew words the different truths that I believe we can be impressed by and that can touch our heart. And the phrase that I wanted to look at was in verse 4, where it said she stood at a distance. His sister, we read, stood at a distance. And it's that little phrase, stood at a distance, which we'll be looking at, but I wanted to look at the word distance. Now, this is the word rakoch. Okay, that's the word rakoch. And that means far off. Okay, long ago. To widen. To withdraw. Far off, long ago, widen, withdraw. All right, so you get the idea of slightly different elements of this word to distance. And when you think of Miriam in this situation, she is only about 7 or 8 years old. She's not a mature woman by any stretch of the imagination. So she's in this situation where she sees her brother, and she steps in. She makes a suggestion, and it actually works out very, very well. She becomes a solution to a problem. And that's just something to ponder for a few seconds, just to think about it, is are you and am I willing to become a solution to a problem? Or do we just go along with that problem? Do we allow the problem to grow and to overwhelm us? Or is there a way that God can use you and me in a problematic situation where we can become a channel? We can become a solution. And I think that takes a bit of courage, it takes boldness, it takes ingenuity, creativity, all sorts of good qualities to get in there, to get involved and to turn a situation round. And there's lots of women in the Bible who did that, and you know, a lot of them are obvious, aren't they, with Hannah and Esther and Ruth, etc. But this phrase stood at a distance. I was thinking of how many times it was mentioned in the Bible. And it's mentioned quite a number of times, but just a few I wanted to pick out just to see the difference in the phrases and how they were used. And one of them is in Exodus 20 and 21. You can turn to it later if you'd like to. And the distancing there was from the people towards God, and actually from God to the people, because God was holy. It was only Moses who was able to go up the mountain and have fellowship with God, and there was a distance between the people and God. So that distance was a necessary distance. It was a good distance. It was a distance of respect. So that's not necessarily a bad distancing. It's a distance of respect. The second distance, Luke 17 and verse 12, we have the lepers and how Jesus healed the lepers. And you remember one came back to thank him. But leprosy in New Testament times particularly, you had to distance yourself as a leper and as someone who was not a leper. There had to be a distance of about 12 foot. So it was social distancing, and we're all aware of social distancing nowadays, aren't we? So that was a distancing of safety. So the first distancing was a distancing of respect. This is a distancing of safety and hygiene, which was commanded by God. And so again, that was a necessary distancing. The other one is in Luke 23, verse 49. When Jesus is on the cross, we read that the women, okay, and the disciples too, but particularly the women, because we're looking at women of the Bible, they distanced themselves and they looked on to see what was happening. They looked on from a distance. The important thing about that is that the first two, there was never a coming together of that distancing. That distancing was always going to be there. The second one regarding lepers, that distancing was always going to be there. But the third one, what you find is that the women begin with a distance, but later on, that distance is closed. The gap is closed, and we see them at the tomb. We see them on Resurrection Day, seeking to embalm and put spices on Jesus's body. And that's what I wanted to emphasize in this phrase, stood at a distance. There are times when we need to stand at a distance for various reasons, but generally speaking, God requires you and me to bridge a gap. So the distancing doesn't always stand. And I'm thinking in terms of, you may have distanced yourself from a member of your family. And I've met many people who have done that. They've fallen out with people in their family, whoever it is, and there's a distance there. They've fallen out with a friend, and there's a distance there. And the question is, does God want that distance to remain, like the lepers, and like the respect of fellowship, as we saw, or does he want that gap to be filled up, where we are distancing no longer? So I'd like you to think of any situations in your life with people. It might be you have distanced yourselves from the church for whatever reason. And is that a distancing that's out of respect? Is that a distancing that God has commanded? Well, certainly not. So if it's not the first two, it must be the third. And it's a distancing that needs to be erased, and you need to bring the gap together and to fill it up. When I was thinking of an illustration for this, I was thinking, I might mention her before, but a lady in the First World War called Edith Cavell, and she was a Christian, and she was a great pioneer of medicine, and she was a nurse. And the lovely thing about Edith Cavell, amongst many other lovely things, is that she not only nursed the Allied soldiers in World War I, but she also nursed the Germans too. And I thought that was quite remarkable, really, that she actually got into the middle and did not distance herself even from the enemy. She wouldn't obviously have distanced herself from her own side, but it goes a step further, doesn't it? Not to distance yourself from your enemy. And she didn't. And it may be that I mean, she was caught and she was executed, and you know, what a sad, tragic thing. But the important thing is, all those years later, 106 years later, I'm actually talking about her. So she's left a legacy, she's left a message, she's left a modus operandi of how you do not allow a distance to come between you and someone else or something else. And for Miriam, we can see she could quite easily have thought, well, I'm too young to make a difference. I'm, you know, I can't do anything. It's way beyond me. But there she goes. She gets involved, and she doesn't remain at a distance. So just think about your own life, and if there are distances which you know in God you need to bridge that gap. Okay, so if you wanted a title for that little first section, I suppose you could call it Miriam the Sister. All right, Miriam the Sister. Obviously, as a sister, she had another drive, another passion, because she was related to the baby, Moses. So that's Miriam the Sister. The second point is Miriam the Singer. All right, so that's in Exodus 15, Miriam the Singer. So she goes from being a sister, and she's still a sister, but she's moving on now to being Miriam the Singer. Now, just to give you a little bit of context, as we know that these are the chapters leading up to here, where the people of God have left Egypt, and they've been followed by the Egyptian army, who have been completely drowned in the sea. Okay, and so Exodus 15, you'll have a little title above that the Song of Moses and Miriam. So it appears straight away that then Moses and the Israelites sang this song to the Lord. So Miriam's joining in this song. She's not particularly prevalent in these early verses because they're all singing it together. But what happens as we go through the particular chapter, she begins to be picked out. And then in verse 20, this is the verse I wanted to concentrate on a little bit. Verse 20, then Miriam, the prophetess, Aaron's sister, took a tambourine in her hand, and all the women followed her with tambourines and dancing. And Miriam sang to them, sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. The horse and its rider he has hurled into the sea. Now that is the song that they were all singing, but the passage particularly picks out Miriam towards the end of this particular passage. And the reason she is singing, the reason she is excited and overjoyed like all the other Israelites, is because of the phrase in verse 11, and that's the Hebrew word I want to look at. In verse 11 it says, who among the gods is like you, O Lord? Okay, and it goes on to say, majestic in holiness, awesome in glory, working wonders. And there is a song years and years ago that was sung. Music was put to those words. All right, so that's the song, and it's who among the gods is like you, O Lord? Now in the Hebrew, who among you is the little phrase mi chamocha, mi chamocha. All right, that's the phrase. So it's the me, that's who, chamocha, who among the gods. And that means, these are the meanings, who is like you, who is just, that means right and fair, like you, and who will stand up like you. All right, so the important thing that motivates this song is that they have experienced an amazing deliverance. And this is their affirmation of God. All right, there are the words once again. This is their affirmation of what God has done. And they're all singing it. They're all joining in. But I just think it's so interesting why God picks out Miriam. Now, it says that Moses and the Israelites sang this song, so Miriam isn't particularly picked out at the beginning. But God chooses her and picks her out, and he gives her some descriptions about herself that we wouldn't otherwise have known. And it says she's a prophetess. She's Aaron's sister, which we know. She takes a tambourine in her hand, and all the women followed her. And I like that. All the women followed her. So she's singing like everyone else. And what is happening here, if we were taking a social media term, we would say that she was an influencer. I don't know whether you've come across that phrase. I'm sure many of you have. Someone who is an influencer. Now, if you're a firm, if you're a company, and you're trying to sell a product, you might employ an influencer. And an influencer, among many, many other things, basically is someone who identifies with the brand that you are trying to sell, the name of whatever it is. So they identify with the brand. And secondly, they try and entice people to buy the brand. They are endeavouring to change people's mind or to bring people in line with what the brand is saying. Someone who is an influencer. And women, according to the top 20 Instagram influencers, okay, I think it's just the UK, but the top 20, out of the top 20, 14 out of 20 are women. And these are women who are paid, given some sort of royalty, they are paid to be an influencer. So they identify themselves with the brand. And you look at any adverts on telly, and you look, and perhaps it's be an interesting study, I've not done it myself, how many adverts are there that use women as the forefront person? And are women able to sell something in a better way than men? So looking at that, what I see here is that Miriam is an influencer because of her singing, because of her dancing, because she picks up a tambourine and she does it. And the line is, all the women followed her. And so we have a woman, that's why I've called it Miriam the singer, because she had to do something in order to be an influencer. And we said earlier on that an influencer is someone who identifies with a brand. Well, the brand, we could say, is an affirmation of who God is. We're trying to appreciate this brand called God. Okay, that's the brand. She identifies with that by joining with everyone else who is singing. And if anyone was in doubt as to why they were singing or how they were singing or anything like that, there's no doubt that Miriam takes the lead and other people follow. And I want to encourage you with that as a woman today. I mean, if you're a man and you're listening to this, the principle's the same. Because men can learn from women of the Bible, just like women can learn from men of the Bible. But probably there's a lot more women who will learn from women of the Bible. And it's an encouragement for you women to rise up in the right way and to influence a situation, just like Miriam did. To make an impact, to be able to identify what God is doing in your life, what Jesus is doing in your life, and to take a lead in that. Whether it's giving testimony, whether it's speaking in church, whether it's leading by way of prayer, example, whether it's leading by way of sharing your faith and inviting people along to the church. In my experience, a lot more women are far more effective in relational evangelism than are men. Men are the ones that I would say, evangelistically, who would normally stand up in front of a crowd and evangelize from the platform. There are other men who work for organizations, etc., but by far, I would say the most effective way of reaching people for Christ and therefore changing your neighborhood, your society, and our world is a relational form of evangelism. And that's where I believe women score much, much higher than men, because I believe, generally speaking, they are more relational. So will you take that? Will you take your tambourine like a baton, if you like? Why don't you go out, and if you haven't got a tambourine, why don't you buy a tambourine? You know, there are some scarves that you can buy, silk scarves with all sorts of, you know, words of Mary and Miriam and tambourines and that. You can get them from Jewish shops all over. And you can dance before the Lord, and you can wave your silk scarf in the air. It's a proclamation and an affirmation of what God has done for you in Christ. We're not talking about a physical going through the sea. We're talking about a spiritual deliverance. Hallelujah. And so therefore we pick up our tambourine and we dance and we influence others to do the same. I was thinking of another famous lady, Marie Curie. And she was a scientist, chemist, you know, into medicine and all that sort of thing. And she discovered radium and polonium. Now, you'll see that I'm reading my notes, so I want to get it right. Radium and polonium. And she had a number of firsts, which I think was really important. She was the first woman to receive a doctorate, a PhD, from her French university. She was the first woman employed as a professor in Paris. She was the first woman to receive the Nobel Prize. She was the first woman to receive the Nobel Prize twice. So we have a number of firsts there. And these women, Edith Cavell and Marie Curie, they are game changers. They change and influence not just a local society, but the world. And, you know, I believe that today, as we look at this study, you can take it as read that God can use you in as powerful a way as he was using Miriam in this situation, in her capacity as a singer. And General Booth has said, he said, some of my best men are women. So the founder of the Salvation Army, some of my best men are women. So be encouraged, people, women and men, as we look at the women of the Bible, as we look at Miriam and her influence in that praise situation as a singer, giving affirmation to God. So if the first point was Miriam the sister, and the second point was Miriam the singer, the third point, which seems a bit negative, but it's not really, was Miriam the sinner. So not the singer, but the sinner. So if we look at Numbers chapter 12, and we're 28 minutes now, so I'll try and get through in the next 10 minutes maximum. But Numbers chapter 12, and we have a situation where both Miriam and Aaron, they begin to quabble and grumble at Moses. They question his authority. They say, you know, has the Lord spoken only through Moses? Hasn't he also spoken through us? And the Lord heard this, and he was really, really angry. So you think, well, goodness me, such a woman like Miriam, who is dancing before the Lord and affirming how great God is, then she starts to turn on her own brother, the very brother that she helped to rescue when he was born. And we have to say, don't we, that whether you're a man or a woman or whoever we're looking at in the Bible, we have got feet of clay. And we have to realize that. The Bible says that if we think we stand, take heed, be vigilant, lest we fall. And this was not one of Miriam's greatest situations and experiences in her life, because God didn't like the fact that they rose up against Moses and they got punished and they paid some circumstances. There were circumstances. Now, I just quickly want to look at her name. Okay, Miriam. It comes from the Hebrew for Mara, which means bitter or rebellion. Bitter or rebellion. So you can see already within her name there is a sense of bitterness and rebellion. And that's exactly what is happening here. But I didn't want to leave this study on a negative note and dwelling on the sin of Miriam. But wherever there is sin, wherever there is failure in your life and in my life, whenever we come up short, God has and does always provide a way for us to get through these things. As the song goes, God will make a way where there is no other way. And if you just turn to Exodus, back to Exodus, where we were before, okay, Exodus 15. The reason we went to Numbers was just to make reference to the rebellion, okay, that was there. They paid the consequences. Miriam became leprous, and so whatever we do, there are consequences, aren't there, of our actions. And one of the consequences, which actually we read in the Numbers passage, is the people couldn't carry on in their journey until Miriam had recovered. Because in Numbers 12, God puts her outside the camp and says, you stay outside the camp for 7 days. And then when you're recovered, you can come back in and you can carry on with your journey. So her sin and Aaron's sin, but we're looking at Miriam today, affects a couple of million people, or however many people there were. So she slows the whole thing down because of what she's done. So we need to see that our failings sometimes are not just about us, but they will affect other people if we're not careful. But this is the bit I love about this whole thing, that Miriam, in her sin, in her weakness, in her feet of clay, don't forget her name, Miriam, the Hebrew root is Mara. So when we look at Exodus 15, and from verse 22 onwards, they come to a place of Mara, okay, in verse 23, which means bitterness. So the water's bitter, the people start to grumble again, and so they start to sin, all right, as they did numerous times in their journey. And God comes up with a solution. He is a solution God. He's a God who makes a way. He's a God who gives light in darkness. He's a God who gives freedom from slavery and all those other lovely things about him. And what happens is that Moses cried out in verse 25. He cries out to the Lord. We're in Exodus 15 now, verse 25. And the Lord showed him a piece of wood. He threw it into the water, and the water became sweet. Now that word wood in the Hebrew is the word etz, E-T-Z. etz, and it means a tree, or it means sticks. All right, a tree or sticks. And this is the one that I really, really love. It can mean a carpenter, one who works in wood. And I think that's lovely because that is a direct reference to Jesus, who was a carpenter. And you wouldn't have expected Jesus to be referred to prophetically in Exodus 15. But you see, in their distress, in their bitterness, in their not seeing any hope, not seeing any way out, God provides a piece of wood. God provides a tree. Okay, and that word is etz. And in Deuteronomy chapter 21 and verse 22, it says, "Cursed is everyone who hangs on a tree." It says that in Galatians 3 verse 13 as well. Now that word tree in Deuteronomy 21 is the same word, it's etz. It's the same word that's in Exodus 15. And who do we know who was cursed on a tree? That's Jesus. So again, we're looking at Miriam as the sinner because God comes in and he forgives her through the prayers of Moses and Aaron. Okay, God forgives her and he brings hope and he brings healing from the leprosy in what was a really, really bad situation. And that's why I include Miriam being the sinner, because you see, we don't just stop at sin. We don't say, well, I'm a sinner, I've failed, full stop, end of story. It is not the end of the story. And so when you look at your life and you think, and you know, we're very good, aren't we, at disqualifying ourselves from ministry, from opportunities, because of our past, because of the things we've done wrong. Very good at doing that. But you mustn't disqualify yourself when God hasn't disqualified you. And with Jesus around, there is always hope and opportunity and forgiveness and healing and grace. And particularly this time of the year, Christmas time. What do we read in John 1? The law was given by Moses, but grace and truth came in Jesus. And that's what you and I, in our sin and in our failings, that's what we rely on. That's who we rely on. So whatever you've done in the past, whatever you're struggling with, it doesn't necessarily mean that it disqualifies you from the good two first points that we saw in Miriam's life. Being that of someone who got involved because she was the sister and she didn't stand at a distance and she closed the gap, and being someone who was an influencer. It doesn't stop any of that, and God using you in that way. And just the last point, which I think is lovely, and it's in Micah chapter 6. Okay, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah. Okay, Amos, Jonah, Micah. Now in Micah chapter 6 and verse 4, it just says, I brought you up out of Egypt and redeemed you from the land of slavery. I sent Moses to lead you. Okay, so he's the leader, he's the prophet, and Aaron, okay, and he's the high priest, and Miriam. Now, God could have easily left Miriam out there, but he doesn't. He includes her in. And to me, that if the second point, as Miriam as a singer is affirming God, the third point, Miriam as a sinner is being affirmed by God. And this is proof of the affirmation. that some 700 years later, after the Exodus account, God is affirming Miriam. And if that doesn't bless your heart, then I don't know what will. So in our sin, in our failing, in our shortcomings, in Jesus Christ, and because of his blood shed for you and for me, with that bit of wood, with that tree, and the carpenter placed on that tree, on that cross, God affirms you today as he did Miriam. So what a wonderful story. There's lots more we could have said about Miriam, but we'll leave it there. And there's other ways you can meditate on those things, meditate on them, allow them to bring forth fruit in your life. So that finishes a little study in Miriam and those associated words. And the Lord bless you, and I will see you next week. Okay, bye-bye.